Book 2 completed. I had expected to get through this book a lot faster than I did. It was kind of interesting. This book was of a much higher quality than Gardens of the Moon. I would say it's better in basically every regard. But while Gardens of the Moon took me 2 weeks of pushing through it, for some reason, I just couldn't push through this book. It was a lot better, and there were a lot more pros, I'd say, for this, but just with how dense it is, how many of what was happening, the issue I kept running into was I would read a section of it and then not retain anything about like what just happened, which when you're trying to talk about books or review something, going like, oh, that was cool. What? I don't know what happened, but it was super epic. Doesn't make for the best kind of discourse or even any type of review for a book. So I think for future Malazan books, just as a heads up, it's going to take me the time it's going to take for these. I think honestly just taking them like one chapter at a time with notes and mapping out what's happening is going to be critical to really understanding what Malazan actually is. And I got through about like the first half of the book before I realized that's what I have to do. Even after finishing the book, I went back and looked at some like summaries and like try to review what actually happened in the first half, and there were loads of things that I was just missing. Future reference, I think this entirety of Malazan is probably going to take me about a year to do, so it's good to have long-term goals, I guess. I actually enjoyed this quite a bit more than the last book, but I still have some of the same criticisms. Some things have been alleviated, but I think one of the biggest things, and this also ties into the advice that I've heard other people talk about or give when they're talking about this series, is that you don't want to try to understand everything, just realize you're not going to undo it and then just go with the flow. And the issue that I have with that is how I read and why I enjoy reading is I like to be along for the ride. So mystery boxes, whatever, that's fine. I like that mystique going around there. But when you don't understand the actual context of which this material is being presented, it takes me out of the immersion. I went in with that mindset of I'm just going to let everything happen, experience it, try not to like take too many notes and put everything together. And what I found out is until I got about like halfway through, Deadhouse Gates, things started to click a little bit more, but then I remembered almost nothing about like the first half of the book. Maybe this is just because I've been spoiled with people like Brandon Sanderson or different hard magic systems, but for me it just feels like magic and a lot of these like things with warrens and ascendancies and the gods and everything, they're so critical to the plot that not having the understanding of what actually is happening with them means that I can't ever really fully understand the plot. So the format of how I want to do this is I want to talk about some of the cons, some of the pros, keep them spoiler free, give a bit of a recommendation based off of that, and then jump into the specifics. Some of the things I thought were great, some of the things I thought were bad, but then that section will be very spoiler heavy. But let's get started with some cons. So one of the biggest issues I think I have with Erickson's writing is, and this is kind of a problem with his scope, I don't like how zoomed out some of the prose gets. Is you're getting into these like extremely epic cinematic scenes, and I get it, it's like when you zoom out, it's like, oh cool, all this crazy stuff's happening, and you're watching it through just this very zoomed out lens of stuff, and it takes you out of it. It creates a degree of separation I don't really like. I think it's much more impactful when you're inside of a character's head as everything's going completely to shit, and you're able to get into it more, and I think that delivers more powerful emotional punches than some of what could have been for Erickson. But, that's more of a personal preference for me. I prefer my carnage and grimdark up close and personal, and you still get a good bit about that in some of Erickson's other plot threads, but like Coltaine's Chain of Dogs specifically, I'm not going to spoil anything, but I thought it would have been way better to have some different viewpoints and when that was actually happening. The other things I still don't like, and I think this is something I'm just not going to like about the series in general, and maybe my opinions on this will change as I go through a second read-through of this, is there's a lot of hand-waving and read and find out, and it's done to me in an unsatisfying way. So, some of the main characters, you have these very critical plot points where it's like, this absolutely changes everything that's happening, this is huge, it's huge, But rather than getting into that, it's just kind of like, oh yeah, no, that person's this person now. It's like, what? Or, hey, this person, oh yeah, no, he's a god. He's a what? How did that happen? It's like, oh yeah, no, people become gods here. Like, what do you want to do about it? And I know like later on you'll understand a bit more of how this happens and stuff, but there was one scene where a character like, gets punched in the face, and then like just based off that interaction, everyone's like, oh wow, you're almost going to be a god, or you're going to be an ascendant. And everyone just kind of like, oh, and then they go about like their day, and like with no explanation, no context and stuff. And it's like, I know once again in the future this will be something that you understand more, but it's like when these things happen repeatedly, you're just kind of taken out, and it's like, wait, what? How did this happen? Like, what? I'm sure later on that it will get better, but that leads into my other kind of point is this is something I heard that actually, once again, Brandon Sanderson talked about when he got into the Stormlight series. A lot of people complained about like, how slow it starts and them not getting into it. A lot of the criticism sounds very similar to some of the issues I'm having with Malazan. And something I realized and that he mentioned was that, by the time he started releasing the Stormlight archives, he had built up the trust, or hopefully built up the trust of his readers in his previous books. They know that he does these really cool hard magic systems, and generally you're going to have this cool explosion of things that as a reader that's a fan of his, that you'll get paid off in some really cool way, or maybe he'll subvert your expectation in even a cooler way. And so for me in Stormlight, going through it, like I had trust that it would develop and would get cool. So as I'm reading it through it, I'm just excited to see like, oh wow, like look at all this build up, this payoff is going to be amazing, because I'm much more familiar with Sanderson's work, and like I'm trust is going to pay off. Because I don't have that context with Erickson, it leads me going like, people say it's good, people say it's like epic and it's really cool when it all clicks together and the convergence, but I'm just not quite there yet. So, second read through, maybe things change, but that for me, I think, is still a negative about this series. Now for some of the pros, so now that I have some context from finishing Gardens of the Moon and know some of the characters and a bit more about, their goals, motivations, what's happening, when I got into it, I actually really got into it. And for me, that was about, half the book. I was like actually enthralled and like invested in what was happening. Some of the characters I really enjoyed in plot lines, I especially like Kalam's plot line, where I'm like, oh, cool, I know what you're doing, I know what the goal is. Yeah, there's still some confusion about, you guys are traveling through these things and what actually is that. But just from a characterization and the plot that was happening, I thought that Erickson got a lot better in this book. Some of the things that were happening, even with like the confusion of not knowing or not being able to get it fully into intellectually some of these things that were happening, I was still getting quite a bit of emotional punch from some of the scenes. And, even with the zoomed out scope where it makes things a little harder to emotionally connect, it still built up these really crazy cinematic things that I just thoroughly enjoyed. I guess a little fun tidbit was in my research of more into the Malazan universe and this book specifically, they have this giant big war campaign that's happening during which, and Steven Erickson is a big into war games himself, so I guess he had little miniatures, and he was modeling out each of the battles that was happening, kind of as he was recreating it as a historical type of deal. So that shows in some of the scenes and stuff. You can tell that a lot of thought went into how this is being built, and you're seeing the effort and the scope of what's being built, and it is very cool. And two, with the little context I got from the first book and the first half of this book, when we start getting to the next one, it's what is a warren, where is a warren, how is a warren? But I at least have the initial context of understanding that, hey, this is something a mage happens, and sort of power comes through here somehow, and you can travel through it. But it gives me more hope to actually read and find out about these things, because it's not just all blank. Now that you start to get more into this world and seeing more of what's happening, you're getting a lot more trust into actually wanting to read and find out about things. Some of the characters you're going through there, you get very little context of them, but then in little glimpses that are happening in some of the dialogue and stuff, you're like, oh, this is actually pretty cool, or ooh, that's pretty sad and tragic. And so I'm seeing these pieces being set up in a really cool way, and some are being taken off and some are doing there, but it's like I'm now starting to actually get invested in what's happening. This was a much better read than the first one. I put it out where, it still wasn't my favorite, but I can at least appreciate what's happening with it. Maybe in the next book, I hear by book 3, whether or not you're going to like or not like the series, but I'm at least now excited to see what's going to happen in book 3 versus pensive, which I was at the end of book 1. So I think it's still too early for me to actually say if I would recommend this series or not to someone. What I can say, and this echoes to the point I made in my first video, is if you are someone who likes to dig and have to work to find everything out, and you get joy from going around and piecing everything together and really just slowly finding out more and more about these worlds, and you absolutely love world building, then I think this would be a good book for you. What gives me hesitation is that this book itself is, pretty rated highly up in the series as kind of one of the best examples of what Malazan is. And I don't know if that includes just from a first read, or if that means, as you know, the whole series is just one of the better books with all that context that I am currently missing. My main issue with it was if I wasn't trying to meticulously map what was happening and taking notes, then I would have no idea what was happening. And I talked earlier about why I wasn't able to fully engage with the material, and how for me, having context and understanding of what's actually happening makes me invested in the series. So that makes it hard for me to just oh, please, here, enjoy this. In my mind, it's kind of like, hey, you should go do this homework. I swear there's a lot of value in this, but it is homework. Make sure you study and take your notes. And have you thought about these things in order to fully appreciate it? But the sheer accomplishment of what Erickson's been doing, and seeing how the world actually is expanding and becoming more of that giant Malazan beast and stuff. If you like epic fantasy, then you should check it out just for that thing itself. So far, it's slowly expanding and expanding and expanding, but what we're seeing is just this really meticulous giant world that's being created. And I know there was about 9 years difference between when the first book and the second book was published, but you can tell that the amount of thought and effort that has gone into creating or crafting this huge giant world with all these crazy things is really crazy. And the fact he's doing it without explaining anything is he is a madman. But I hear the word convergence thrown out a lot about this series. It's just as you go through it, eventually everything just clicks, and then all of a sudden it's absolutely amazing. And then on the second read through, you're like, oh my god, this is brilliant. How did I didn't see this the first time? So I will probably do that, but that is a giant task of itself, and I can't say that this was a book that I couldn't put down. I very much could put it down. I actually read 6 books in between this book, trying to read through it just because I needed a break from trying to actually understand what's happening. So it's not light reading at all. But my hope, and what I'm starting to actually see glimmers of, is that when it does pay off, it is such a magnitude of just, holy shit, he pulled this off. So now I want to get into some of the actual plot threads. So spoilers are ahead. So if you just want to stop now and spend a month reading this book, bookmark this video and come back in a month, because I'm going to talk about, some of the things I actually really enjoyed, some of the things I didn't like so much, and some missed opportunities, but I will be spoiling the shit out of this book. So if you're still with me, let's go on. So to get started, what I want to do is kind of go through each of the character arcs. I'm going to group a few of them together just because they all appeared together, and focus in on some characters more than the others. But let's get it started with the Felisin arc. So it felt like Steven Erikson was having a Robin Hobb moment. If you haven't read the Robin Hobb series, it feels like she just hates the main character Fitz, because it's just, what is every bad thing that I can make happen to this character happen? And let's do it with glee and joy. From doing some research on it, it seems like there is a bit of a debate on that character. A lot of people find her to be annoying, but for me, it never really bothered me because of the context. She's a 15-year-old girl plucked out of nobility and sold into slavery, where she gets sexually exploited and becomes addicted to what's basically crack, Durang, and just has a real shitty hell of a time of it. I would not expect any 15-year-old male or female, or really any person in general, to have that happen to them and then just be like, hey, I'm still kind of chill about it. So having her reactions being so sharp and, annoying or, critical, it makes sense when you're piling in that type of drama onto a character and then pushing them forward. Some of the stuff, though, I didn't like about her arc is one of the big criticisms I have with the book, and that is the magical hand-waving. I remember reading through it, and then all of a sudden she just became the Shaik Reborn. And I was like, did I miss something? I go back and stuff, and I was like, no, she just goes through a scene, and one time she is not the Shaik, and then get a little bit of hand-waving, and then boom, she just turns into it. And part of this probably is my lack of context and understanding of how the magic system works. But for such a big event of import, throughout the book, we're talking about the whirlwind, the Shaik, how they're going to leave this massive revolution in this critical moment of this character, and it just seems like at 1 second she's just going around doing her thing, and the next she's now a magical power of someone with no real explaining or understanding. And later on you get into it where you find out that she instead isn't actually the Shaik Reborn, but made a deal with the whirlwind goddess herself. But all of it just felt really loose and unexplained and a bit of a deus ex machina for me. We'll see if I feel the same way on the second read through, but for me it just felt like the plot needed that to happen, and then rather than having a progress or an explainable event happening, it was just like, no, that's just what she is now. But I thought the main things I actually liked about her storyline was I liked her relationships with Heboric and Bauldin. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're pretty fucked up and kind of twisted, but I think that's a lot of where Steven Eriksson's writing actually shines. Like, I liked Heboric as a character. Some of the mystery that was actually written around him, I thought that was done really well, where obviously, we don't quite understand what's happening at this point with, his former god, some of the inscriptions that he has on him, his newfound ghost hands and stuff. That was actually written in such a way where that mystery is later going to unfold, and it is going to be pretty relevant. Bauldin, too, I thought he was a super cool world-building tool. I mean, absolutely is just a giant dickhead and asshole. And, watching his character interact with Felisin was just brutal. It is a dirty, grimdark world. So when they have that one scene where Felisin wants to try to murder him by sleeping with him, and he knows that she's going to try to kill him, but then just goes ahead and has sex with a 15-year-old girl anyway. Super dark, super messed up. Him as a character and a world-building tool, I thought was actually pretty interesting. Going to his history, finding out that, there was a rival organizations to the Claws, and, there were talents, and using him as to expose more of the world-building and some of the history. Like, as we're going through and learning about the series, we know that, Felisin took over, and, she made a bunch of changes, used the Claws to enforce some really brutal things, but we don't have a lot of context of what the Empire was like before then. We just know that with this change that a lot of things started going downhill, and that's a major plot point. So using him and kind of showing some of the earlier artifacts of what the world was like was actually pretty cool just to watch. I do feel like his death was kind of forced, where he just needed to not be there for the plot to continue going forward, and in my mind died a pretty dumb death where it's like, oh, I thought I was invincible to this now. And up until that point, his character, while being an asshole, had been an extremely competent one with a lot of knowledge and being, basically, a spy, assassin, master. You'd think there'd be more common sense there, but, while I think the writing in here improved, there is still areas where I feel like some of the plot and dialogue is just forced to happen because plot needs to go forward and it needs to happen. Not the best, but overall I thought like just the interaction between those three characters were super cool, and seeing where they're going to go forward with the characters, with the powers and these new type of things, I'm actually pretty excited about. So while Felisin wasn't my favorite when it first started, going through it and actually understanding her arc and everything, I'm actually pretty interested in what's going to happen. It's terrifying to think what she's now going to do with an apocalyptic army at her back. Next is Coltaine and Duiker, or Duiker. The Historian. I am combining these two characters just because there's a large amount of overlap with it. Overall, I really enjoyed Coltaine's arc. I thought the Chains of Dogs was a very cool arc. The characters themselves, I actually really enjoyed them as characters. I do have some of the criticisms that I had before with how some of the things were progressing in the plot and how I feel like some of it was like hand waved about, but both characters I thought were extremely likable and, enjoyable to read more and more about. So when they both were so brutally and sorrowfully taken away and done in such a sad, epic way, it was, that definitely gave it an emotional punch and an impact. And I enjoy that about Grimdark because it means that no one's safe. And so when you're reading through these characters, going through these plot and knowing that there is no plot armor, because you can have these main characters that are big plot movers or very invested in there and they can just be like stripped away with a moment's notice, you wind up caring a bit more and the stakes are actually high. I do think it would have been better for how they finished off Coltaine is they did this big epic cinematic type of battle where they zoomed out, it's like someone's watching from a distance as he's making his last stand, where it's like, oh, he has only 500 soldiers left and now there's only 100, and the wizard's trying to keep the crows coming from taking his soul away and like making sure that he can like escape to the afterlife. It's all cool, epic, and cinematic, but I feel like it would have been much better if instead at some point you got to go through his POV during the last stand. And I understand that's a very hard thing to do because you're having to basically go through someone's last moments and try to really get in that nitty and gritty, which I haven't actually seen Erickson write yet, so I'm curious if he's ever going to do that in the future. But having Squint come in and experience his emotions and the trauma at him of having to kill his beloved commander just to like give him like mercy or kill or prevent him from being captured was still very big and impactful, and I thought that was extremely well done. Same thing was Duiker's end, having him just kind of make it towards the end and then just being like, oh, we're just going to treat you like all the other soldiers, and then just wind up getting crucified. And very dark, especially because I thought his character was super likable. He was an historian, so he was a big source of context and exposition for me. And I thought he was just a cool character in general. The whole time he's going through, he was a lowly soldier that got picked out by the previous emperor to be a historian. So his perspective from going from, being a battlefield grunt to the person who's actually recording the history, it was just a really cool arc. And having him just suddenly like snuffed out was unexpected and dark. But, that I like Grimdark. I like these type of things. So I thought he too had a big punch. So let's talk about Icarum and Mappo. So I almost missed what was happening the first time I was reading through this. It wasn't until later on I started to pick up like, hey, did I miss something? Some of the context of having people react to him and stuff I didn't quite pick up on at first, and it wasn't until later on that you're starting to get deeper and deeper into the sheer like tragedy of like those two characters. So like going back and rereading their plot lines, it hit really different once I understood what was actually happening. I think overall I like Kalam's plot thread the best, but I thought Icarum's plight was the most interesting by far and most original, following around this character who has amnesia that is a literal like walking like nuclear bomb. Basically just at a moment's notice waiting to Hulk out and destroy everything was extremely interesting. And then just having him being such an ancient part of everything and leading more exposition on like the Jagged race and some of the old stuff in the previous, like I didn't really quite understand how important this character was to Malazan and the plot in general. And then just like the sheer strategy, because you have like Mappo, one of his friends, and they're kind of sealed together by tragedy. He's taking care of Icarum as a watcher and keeping him from just going on a sheer like devastating annihilation. It's just terrible and beautiful at the same time. It's really sad, and you're waiting for like this character just to go on an absolute rampage. And later on, as he actually escapes out from like the Termalor house, and rather than getting captured and finally being sealed away and safe, they meet Icarum's father, who's like now saying like, hey man, like this was the plan. It took us so long to try to get this one sealed away. We really need this to happen. This guy keeps like annihilating cities, and he's just so like a loose cannon. Like, this is terrible. But Icarum doesn't remember any of this, and you're having this like really terrible scenes where he'll like just not remember like slaughtering a village, and then he's like, oh, why is there blood on my sword? And Mappo's having to go like, oh, it was just there, it's we found it that way. And he's like, oh, okay. So there's something like beautifully terrible about, someone who is essentially has like Alzheimer's or amnesia that has the power of just complete destruction over just vast amounts of thing. And I thought it was just a super cool concept, having a embodied force of destruction and annihilation, just not really know where he's at or what's happening, and having them just wander the earth looking for purpose. That was, for me, one of the more memorable and interesting plot threads through this whole book. So Fiddler, Crokus, and Apsalar, I really enjoyed their plot lines in Gardens of the Moon. I'd say out of everyone's story, I enjoyed the most out of Gardens of the Moon, and that was theirs. But I felt like it was weaker in this book for them. I think they're all really interesting characters. I really enjoyed Crokus and his bond with Apsalar, and then the whole Apsalar concept of, being possessed by Cotillion, and, early on in the first book, you just see these things get set in motion with her, where she's just this terrifying, possessed girl that no one quite knows what to do with, and, is scaring the shit of even people like the Empress. So I thought she was a really interesting character, but in this book, the scenes that they were going through in there, I just felt like they were the least impactful for me. But some of the big reveals of exposition and what's actually happening came through their plot lines. Learning that Cotillion and Shadowthrone were actually the Emperor and his old assassin that ascended rather than actually getting assassinated by the Empress was really fascinating, and what that meant for the plot leading up to here, because these are two of the guys that are trying to organize the assassination of the scene and get a bunch of plot moving, realizing that, oh, this was actually the people that were just in charge before, and trying to understand what that means for the plot, and just that idea of ascendance in general, or the gods in general. One of the reoccurring themes that you're saying in book 1 and 2 is that, if you can pray for anything, pray that the gods never realize who they are, because they want to play their games and they're changed by their games, and you do not want to be the sword of a god, or you don't want to be the instrument in which these guys are going to play their things of power, because that's basically going to ruin your life. So watching how that's coming together and seeing what happens when you have a group of people that are actually getting pushed forward is extremely interesting. Crokus was the coin bearer. Apsalar was possessed by Cotillion. But later on, when they actually meet up with Icarum and Mappo, I think that the plot got a lot better, so I really enjoyed reading more of that. I thought that was better, but the first half of the book when they're going through, I didn't really get into. I didn't get a lot out of it. It was probably the least memorable of the entire book for me. One criticism I had about it was when they were trying to say that Shadowthrone was pushing, Apsalar to become the Shaikh Reborn. I feel like that should be important, and that should be a big kind of reveal or pushing forward, but once again, I don't have any context of what that is, or why it's important that someone is the Shaikh Reborn, or any of this means. So when you're seeing these plot threads getting pushed to certain destinations, and you don't understand what that destination entails or anything, it just fell flat for me. I'm really interested to see how I'm going to feel if I ever pick up this book for a second series, because I'm getting pushed towards goals I don't understand or even remotely know what those entail. So right now there's just no stakes for me to understand why it's important that an ascendant god's trying to push this one character towards this one goal and destination. So it'll be cool to see how that all resolves, and the convergence and how all that actually plays out. But for me, in this book, on this read, I just felt like their storylines were the weakest. So last, and probably my favorite character plot through this whole thing, is Kalam. I have always liked assassin plot lines. When Assassin's Creed first came out, I loved that game. My email in middle school was Assassin32K, so whenever you have a good sneaky boy that has long daggers skulking through the night and just doing assassin things, I am always on board. So having a character like Kalam, I am immediately drawn to and find them super engaging. I thought as a exposition device and a plot device, Kalam is one of the more interesting ones, because he's not a magical person, and he's tied to so many different portions of the world. So when you're watching him go through the world and interact and trying to resolve, the fact that he, has that Malazan part of his life and then the whirlwind part of his life, and seeing how those converge and intersect, you learn a lot more about the world, and I think that's also why I'm a big fan of his character. I also like how he's being written and Erikson's take on him, which, adds to the stakes and really getting that tension going up as he's going through some of these action sequences. Throughout these books, he is a devastating force. You're watching him, he is feared by the Claw. Everyone speaks of him in hushed tones like he's an absolute living legend of an assassin. You're just watching him dual dagger, crossbow bolt everyone to death real quickly without really struggling. For the most part, but you're getting into scenes where he can get overwhelmed. Towards the last end of the book, when he's trying to kill Felisin, he's getting stabbed a bunch of times, hit by crossbow bolts. By the time he actually gets to the point where he could assassinate the Empress, he's just like, well, hopefully she doesn't know that I am barely alive right now, and walking is the most hard thing to possibly do. So the fact that he is mortal in a land that has a bunch of immortals and these crazy powers, it's like, you can have a really cool badass character that still has those stakes and still has that tension going when he's going through these fights. And what's beautiful is you've watched at this point Coltaine, Duiker, all these other characters die that were also really cool, competent people, and you realize that no one's safe, and at any given moment, Erikson can just go and you're dead. So when I'm going through a storyline, and it's one of my favorite characters in the series, I am actually riveted and invested in seeing is he gonna make it? Is he not gonna make it? Because I know the plot and the characters can just change and disappear on a dime, and that's what I think is super cool about Malazan in general so far. What's interesting too, and I'm curious what's going to happen in the future, is so far we have some really, really cool badass characters. You have Icarum, Animander Rake. You're hearing more about the divers and the soul taken and these giant supernatural forces that are just happening, and ascendants, and how do these mortal people that are extremely competent, how do they actually play in into this world? And I didn't mention it in the Coltaine section, but there was one point where Coltaine gets mad at Gessler and goes to punch him in the nose, and all of a sudden his hand shatters because that guy, I guess, is about to ascend. They don't explain it either. It's another one of those pet peeves about it, where it's just you can tell by his blood that guy's about to become a god, but they don't describe the blood or explain anything about it. It's a side point, but how does a character that's revered as such a living legend now, I'm sure there's going to be some sort of supernatural element that happens in the future, how is he going to interact in that world, and how does he stride there? Because he is a very competent, cool, lethal character, but when you're having these characters that can destroy cities by themselves or decimate armies by themselves, what's going to happen? How do they interact? To wrap everything up, Malazan is a really interesting series so far. I'm starting to get glimmers of hope for it. What is extremely interesting, at least to me, is when I'm reading through the book, I'm pretty lukewarm on it. I did absolutely love some character arcs and stuff, but normally when I'm into a book, I just power through it, and I've read some pretty dense books before. I get into it, I can't put it down, and Malazan is so dense that that's just not happening. And so when I finish it, when I'm first done, I don't know what I feel. So much has happened, so much is going on. What I'm finding is, as I dive into the book later on, I'm going through my notes, trying to figure out what happened, what do I actually think about it, realize and can appreciate the scope of what's being done, and it becomes extremely enjoyable to dig into it. So while the writing itself and going through it, or the traditional, I'm just going to pick up a book and read it, I still don't find it super great. But when I'm digging into, what do I think about the characters? What do I think about what happened? What's actually happening with this? It's this giant, crazy, map that I'm trying to put everything together, and there's something inherently enjoyable about trying to figure out, what the actual hell is happening. And my views on it change the more I think about it and the more I dive into it. So from a, writing perspective, I don't think I'm a huge fan of the writing itself. I like grimdark, I like some of the prose, but it's not consistently good at a point where I'm just locked into it, or it's not the exact type of cup of tea where I just can't put it down. And, other epic fantasy books, grimdark books and stuff, normally once I'm in it, it's like, I'm going to finish the book in less a week. And I'm finding it's taken me like a month to get through these books. But the more I dive into it, the more I realize there's more and more to dig and more things are coming out where the scope and there's always a bit more I can go under there. And each time or like a piece clicks in my head, we're like, oh, that's what that meant. And that's what it meant. So I'm like, feel myself getting more and more invested into it. I don't know if I'm going to have like a rating or a review on it until I either get through the next book or get through the entire series or even get through the entire series twice. There's a lot there, and normally what hooks me into a book series is like the storytelling and like the actual like writing and prose itself. But for me right now, it's just kind of the world of what's actually being built. Is I'm just right now extremely fascinated with what actually is happening. And maybe that's a bit of Stockholm Syndrome because I've now read, like 1,800 pages of Malazan. And I realized that, this entire shelf here is more Malazan, and the next book's like 900 pages, and they're just going to get bigger and more dense and more characters and more crazy. I just want to see what this madman's going to do. And, it's not conventionally what attracts me to it, but it's still attracted me to it just because I want to know what happens. And so far, it's interesting. Right now, all I can really say is it's absolutely wild how much detail and world building things that has gone into it, and the fact that it's written the way it is, where it just feels like you have this giant invisible force of plot being pushed through that while right now I don't understand, you can tell all that detail has been mapped out and it's already there. So the amount of time it takes to actually build that together, where you just have people reacting to this giant plot with all these different connected pieces and everything, is absolutely mesmerizing and really crazy to think about. I have hope. I hear by the next one you should know whether or not you like the series, but I might just love to hate the series. So I want to see what happens. I'll finish it. I bought the books. Maybe I just have an innate love of suffering, so I know one way or the other I'm going to finish Malazan. But we'll see, how my thoughts progress on it. It's interesting, and as I've mentioned before, if you like epic fantasy, you read all the big normal stuff and you want something different, or you just like world building or that whole concept of digging into the lore and figuring stuff out, I can start to recommend this more towards you. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not going to rush doing these reviews for these books because so much is happening. I think the best way for me to review this is just do like a chapter a day or a chapter at a time, write down my thoughts, put it together, and then spend some time actually consolidating what I think and feel about the story, especially within the context of the greater story. So it's probably going to be like a month before I release the next one, but I'll be having, drops later on. I'll probably be doing some light novels just to balance it out, mixed in with some non-actual book-related stuff, but more just like genres and, random deep dives into things. But, hopefully you stuck around for this long. It's a longer video than normal, but there's just so much happening, and, I'm still playing with the different formats of how I actually want to do these, like, talks about books and stuff and figuring out my own sort of, YouTube voice itself. So if you stuck around this far, I appreciate you. And, if you let me know what you think about Malazan down below. I had a few of the comments that make me think about it in a different way. So, I'm reading those, and I appreciate it when you guys actually leave that stuff because, Malazan's a new fandom for me. I don't know a lot about it, but there seems to be a lot to dig into. But thank you guys for watching.